what we see often from government, this Liberal government, this NDP Liberal government, is that they try and take every opportunity to avoid accountability and reasonable and fair criticism of their failures. And on Mr. Bain's motion, I didn't hear, and in his preamble or his justification, I didn't hear the falsehood that he said was made against him, nor evidence that anything that was said or repeated by my colleague that it was incorrect. And this is the pattern. And the irony, of course, is that they're saying, Mr. Baines and the NDP Liberal government are saying that it's intimidation if they hope to move a motion that someone else moves a motion that speaks to a different issue that's critical of them. Well, that's intimidation. But they have a motion that, without any evidence, they've put forward to attempt to censure an opposition MP, but that's not intimidation. As if any time, and we heard in the most bizarre terms at the last meeting, a Liberal member say that by simply referencing the behavior of another MP, that it's inciting hate. But that same MP, in the 7 days before, tweeted out, named every Conservative member of this committee looking to engage social media users to reach out to those MPs. Members of Parliament must be accountable to Canadians. And to have the NDP Liberal government try and take a situation like this, let's just be very black and white. Mr. Brock was recognized by the chair of the committee. He had the floor, and he appropriately moved a motion. And the allegation by Mr. Baines is that, oh, that's an intimidation. That's an attempt to try and silence him from doing his job. This is obviously an attempt by Mr. Baines. It's a vexatious motion to try and silence someone who's rightly critical of the government. A great example of the situation we're facing in this country this week and the lack of seriousness by parties in the House with respect to foreign interference. We have the government put forward a bill to finally take some steps to address foreign interference in our democratic institutions, like has been alleged in Steveston Richmond East, Mr. Baines' riding, in the last election. And the official opposition put forward a motion in the House to fast-track the bill so that it could be passed, because we've heard from security officials that it's going to take them up to a year and a half to fully implement this bill, the provisions of this bill. And the NDP withheld consent. They blocked the expeditious passage of legislation to address foreign interference in our democracy.
Craziness.
So there's a lot of big questions about the motivations of people, of members of parties, with respect to serious issues. And it seems like an attempt to control the narrative on what's okay to talk about on foreign interference and what's not okay to talk about on foreign interference. How can we as parliamentarians talk about foreign interference in our elections if we can't talk about allegations of interference in our election, in specific ridings. How can we do that? How can we hear testimony from witnesses on foreign interference when they allege that there were attempts to interfere in their election by foreign state actors, and that person comes and testifies, and then a member repeats that evidence, repeats those allegations, and the individual who's alleged to be a beneficiary of those attempts or of those alleged actions,
they get upset. Yep.
Then says, well, you're attempting to intimidate me by talking about the evidence that we're hearing on a study that the committee has asked to have.
They're so crazy.
I would note that this is now the second meeting where the published notice of meeting had in-camera consideration of a draft report listed, and the committee is not dealing with that. Interestingly, because that study is also critical of government departments. And we see this time and time again, that there are attempts to block the scrutiny of the government that's put on them by the official opposition.
And if it's in
official
camera,
opposition.
like,
well, it's in the name. Our job is to be the
it.
check against the balance of power. Mm-hmm. And after 9 years of this NDP Liberal government, we see that we have a government that is the least transparent in history. And they use every tool to try and silence their critics. Every time there's a criticism of the government, there's an attempt to deflect from it. A government that, spends $1.3 million on so-called affordability retreats. Oh, well, we don't want to talk about that. Let's talk about people who talked about evidence at committee instead. This government that is presiding over a cost of living crisis. The coalition government that's refusing to expeditiously pass legislation to combat foreign interference. Fights tooth and nail to block scrutiny of ministers like Minister Boissonnault and his business associates, Mr. Anderson and Ms. Poon, who are supposed to be here Tuesday. Well, we haven't got through the business of this committee at the last two meetings. I get the suspicion that there's an attempt to block the work of members to scrutinize Minister Boissonnault's actions.
We need to get him in here, guys.
That's the tactic that we're seeing from the NDP Liberal government. And it's interesting that the request is for an apology. I don't need to ask Mr. Brock if that ask was made to him discreetly or in good faith by members opposite before they jumped up on the soapbox, because I know they didn't, because it wasn't an attempt to solicit an apology. It's an attempt to silence criticism of a corrupt government. A prime minister twice found guilty himself of breaking ethics laws. And criticism of a government being deflected by the tactics like we saw at the last meeting that descended into, I believe, intentional chaos by members of the NDP Liberal government.